Mark's heart raced as he stepped out of the house, the early morning sun casting long shadows on their driveway. He had just finished his coffee, ready to enjoy a rare moment of peace, when he heard his wife, Sarah, yell. The sound jolted him to attention, and his pulse quickened. Without thinking, he rushed out the door, his feet pounding the concrete as he approached the source of the commotion. There, in the middle of their neatly paved driveway, Sarah stood, her arms raised defensively as two HOA enforcers loomed over her. One of them, a tall man with a cruel sneer, was gesturing aggressively at her. Mark's blood boiled as he watched Sarah try to explain herself, only to be interrupted by the enforcers' sharp commands. They were demanding she move her car, despite it being parked perfectly legally, and yet, their stance showed no interest in listening to reason. The second enforcer, a woman with a clipboard, stood back, watching the scene unfold, but she was no less hostile. Mark knew this was more than just a typical HOA dispute, it was a personal attack. The enforcers had been harassing his family for weeks now, finding any excuse to create trouble. But today, they had crossed the line. Without a word, Mark's eyes locked onto Sarah, her face pale with fear, her eyes wide in disbelief at the aggressive tone of the enforcers. The man moved closer to her, his body blocking her path, as if preparing to physically force her to comply. That was when Mark's instincts took over. "Hey! Leave her alone!" Mark shouted, his voice booming across the driveway. The enforcers froze for a moment, surprised by his sudden arrival. But it wasn't until Mark took another step forward, his uniform now visible, that they really stopped. The man's hand paused mid-motion, and the woman dropped her clipboard in shock. Mark's FBI uniform gleamed in the sunlight, the insignia unmistakable. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. The enforcers' faces drained of color, their previously bold postures crumbling under the weight of the recognition. The tall man, who had moments ago been threatening Sarah, now took a cautious step back, his eyes darting nervously between Mark and his wife. "FFBI," the woman stammered, clearly rattled. Mark's gaze was cold, his jaw tightening as he took another step forward, closing the distance between him and the two intruders. "That's right," he said, his voice low and steady. "And I suggest you leave my wife alone." The tension in the air thickened, every second feeling like an eternity. The enforcers, now completely unnerved, exchanged a quick, uncomfortable glance. They had no idea that the man they had been harassing for weeks had been working undercover, gathering evidence on corruption that ran deeper than they could have imagined. This was no longer just about parking violations or petty neighborhood squabbles. It was about power, control, and the secrets they were trying to keep hidden. The tall man cleared his throat, his earlier bravado completely gone. "We'll be leaving now," he muttered, stepping back. "Good," Mark replied, his tone unwavering. As they backed away, Sarah's eyes met his, full of relief but also confusion. She had no idea what had just happened or why these people had suddenly backed off. Mark stood still for a moment, watching the enforcers retreat, ensuring they wouldn't return. As they climbed into their truck and drove away, Mark turned to Sarah. His heart ached as he saw the fear still lingering in her eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Sarah nodded slowly, her voice trembling. I don't understand. Who were they? Why did they back off like that?" Mark let out a deep breath, knowing he couldn't keep hiding the truth from her any longer. "Sarah, I've been undercover. These people, they're involved in something bigger than just HOA rules. They've been targeting us because of what I've been investigating." Sarah stared at him in shock, her mind racing to catch up. She had always known Mark worked hard, but she never imagined this. "What have you gotten yourself into?" Mark sighed, his shoulders sagging as the weight of his secrets lifted slightly. "I didn't want to put you in danger. But now, it's time you knew the truth. They're involved in a criminal organization, and I've been gathering intel. Today, they messed with the wrong people. As the truck disappeared down the road, Mark turned back to Sarah, his eyes filled with determination. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he might finally be able to protect the one thing that mattered most, his family. The drive back to their house was silent, the only sound being the hum of the engine. Mark's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He had never wanted to drag his wife into his world of secrets and danger, but today, everything had changed. The look on Sarah's face when she realized what he did for a living, when she understood the magnitude of the situation, was something he would never forget. He could see the confusion and fear lingering in her eyes, and it tore at him. As they pulled into the driveway, Sarah still hadn't said a word. Mark parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He knew this moment was coming, the moment where he had to come clean, to tell Sarah everything. But the weight of the truth was heavier than he had ever imagined. His life had always been about protecting her, keeping her safe from harm, and now, he had to expose the very dangers he had been hiding from her. "Sarah," he began, his voice breaking the silence, "I should have told you before. But I didn't want to put you in harm's way. The work I do, it's dangerous. And now you're in the middle of it too." Sarah looked at him, her face still a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You've been undercover, for how long? And you didn't tell me?" Her voice was soft but edged with hurt. Mark didn't know how to explain, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. "I've been investigating a group of people who've been corrupting the HOA system. They're tied to a lot of illegal activities, money laundering, fraud, and worse. The enforcers today, they were part of that group. They were testing the waters, seeing if they could get to us. I've been trying to gather evidence for months." Sarah shook her head, trying to process everything. "So, those people, the ones who came to our house, they weren't just enforcing some neighborhood rules? They were connected to criminals?" Mark nodded, his chest tightening as the reality of his situation set in. "Yes. I didn't want to get you involved. I thought I could handle it on my own. But today, I realized they were getting closer to us. And I can't hide this from you anymore." Sarah turned away from him, her fingers running through her hair, as if trying to grasp what was happening. "You've been living a lie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant to," Mark replied, his heart sinking. "I thought I was protecting you. But the truth is, I've been hiding it all, everything I've been doing, all the risks I've been taking. And now, they know about you. They know about us." The air around them grew heavier, the tension palpable as Sarah took a deep breath. Mark could see the pain in her eyes, the hurt of betrayal, but there was also something else there, a flicker of determination. "I don't want to be a part of this, Mark. But I can't just sit back and watch while you put yourself, and us, in danger." Mark's heart raced again, this time with a surge of guilt. "I don't want to drag you into this, Sarah. But they're not going to stop. They'll come for us again. And next time, it might not be as easy." "I can handle myself," she said firmly, looking at him now with a spark of resolve in her eyes. "We're in this together, right? If they think they can mess with us, then we'll make them regret it. But I need you to trust me, Mark. We need to face this, together." For a moment, Mark didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to shield her from the dangers he faced every day, but another part, something deeper, understood that she was right. They couldn't face this alone. If the enforcers were part of something much bigger, then they needed to stand together, face it head-on, and fight back. As Mark stepped out of the car, he felt a sense of solidarity that he hadn't felt in months. The road ahead was uncertain, dangerous even, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't facing it alone. Sarah was by his side. And together, they would figure out how to stop the threat hanging over their lives. But as they walked towards the door, the air around them grew colder, the tension still lingering. They knew the fight wasn't over yet, it had just begun. The days that followed were a blur of unease. Mark and Sarah barely slept, spending long hours talking, strategizing, and trying to figure out their next move. The enforcer's sudden appearance in their driveway was only the beginning. Mark had warned Sarah that their lives were about to change, but even he couldn't predict the full extent of what was coming. Each time they heard a car drive by, Mark's eyes would dart toward the window, scanning the street for any sign of danger. It wasn't just about protecting their home anymore, it was about staying one step ahead of an enemy they didn't fully understand. Every moment felt like it could be their last before the storm hit. Sarah, despite the fear that gripped her heart, was resolute. She knew Mark's job had been dangerous, but now it felt personal. They weren't just fighting against a corrupt HOA anymore, they were fighting against a network of criminals who had control over more than just the neighborhood. They had their eyes on something far more powerful, something that could destroy everything Mark had worked for. One evening, Mark received an encrypted message on his phone. His heart sank as he opened it. It was a warning, someone had been watching them. They knew about Sarah now, and that made her a target. The message was clear: back off, or there will be consequences. Mark's hands shook as he read the words, his mind racing. He had expected this, but seeing it written out, a direct threat against his wife, brought a cold wave of fear over him. "What is it?" Sarah asked, sensing his sudden shift in mood. Mark's gaze was hard, his jaw clenched. He didn't want to worry her, but he knew he couldn't keep the truth from her. "They know about you. They're watching us. We can't let our guard down, not even for a second." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, thick with tension. Sarah's face paled, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, looking him in the eyes with a determination that both shocked and reassured him. "We're not running," she said firmly. "We face this together. Whatever they throw at us, we handle it." Mark had always admired Sarah's strength, but hearing her say that now, in the face of the unknown, made him realize just how much they were in this fight together. She wasn't backing down, and neither was he. The next day, Mark met with his contact at the FBI to discuss the next steps. He knew it was dangerous to keep his family in the loop, but Sarah insisted. She wanted to be involved, wanted to understand the full scope of the threat they were facing. As Mark sat across from his contact, Agent Turner, the tension in the room was palpable. The information Mark had gathered had painted a clearer picture of the group they were up against. An underground criminal syndicate that had embedded itself within the HOA system, using it as a cover for their illicit activities. Their influence stretched far beyond just the neighborhood. They had connections in high places, people who would stop at nothing to keep their operations hidden. "We need to move fast," Agent Turner said, his voice low. "If they're threatening your wife, it means they're getting desperate. This isn't just a threat to your job anymore, it's personal. And if they think they can take her out, they'll do it." Mark's stomach churned at the thought. He had always been the one in the field, dealing with dangerous situations, but now, the risk was too real. It wasn't just his life on the line, it was Sarah's, the person he loved more than anything. "We'll need to go on the offensive," Agent Turner continued, tapping a few keys on his laptop to bring up a map of the area. "But we'll have to be careful. These people are connected. If we make one wrong move, we could tip them off. The last thing we want is to push them into a corner." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had always been willing to risk everything for the truth, but this felt different. This time, the stakes were higher. As he left the meeting, his thoughts were consumed with the image of Sarah, standing beside him in the driveway, ready to face whatever came their way. He had never been more determined to protect her, but as the days passed, it became increasingly clear that the road ahead would be far more dangerous than he had imagined. When he returned home, Sarah was waiting for him, her expression calm but serious. She had already started researching the syndicate on her own, learning everything she could. She wasn't going to sit idly by while Mark fought this battle. She was in it with him, and nothing was going to change that. But as the night fell and the shadows grew longer, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a sense of dread creeping in that wouldn't go away. The danger was no longer something they could just plan for, it was here, right at their doorstep, and they were about to face it head-on. The night was heavy with tension, the kind that made Mark feel as though every shadow was hiding something, every noise a prelude to danger. His mind raced with the implications of the threats against Sarah. He had always been prepared for the risks his job brought, but this was different. This was his family at risk. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah standing in the driveway, so innocent yet now wrapped in the same danger he had spent years trying to protect her from. They were sitting together in the living room, surrounded by files and documents about the criminal syndicate. Sarah had insisted on staying involved, refusing to sit back while Mark handled everything alone. She had a fire in her that Mark hadn't seen before, a determination to fight back against the people who had come into their lives with one goal, to destroy it. "Mark," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "We can't just sit here waiting for them to make the next move. We need to be proactive. If we're going to protect ourselves, we need to know what we're dealing with, and we need to do it now." Mark looked at her, his heart heavy with a mixture of admiration and fear. He knew she was right. They couldn't wait any longer, not with the threat hanging over them. But his mind kept circling back to one thing: if they exposed themselves too soon, they could make things worse. This syndicate was ruthless, and they had connections everywhere. One wrong move, and they could lose everything. Including Sarah. "I agree," Mark said, his voice low and steady. "But we have to be careful. This isn't just about us anymore. We're up against people who have no problem using violence to get what they want. They'll come for us again if we make a mistake." Sarah clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. "They're already coming for us, Mark. And I'm not going to sit here waiting for them to strike first." The words hit harder than Mark expected. Sarah had always been strong, but this fire in her eyes, the determination to stand up to this unseen enemy, made Mark feel both proud and terrified at the same time. She was ready to face whatever came their way, even if it meant putting herself directly in harm's way. Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I don't want you to get hurt. This is my fight, Sarah. I can protect you." Sarah squeezed his hand in return. "We're in this together, Mark. You don't get to fight this alone. I'm with you every step of the way." The weight of her words settled deep in his chest. He hadn't expected her to be so willing to dive into the danger, to walk alongside him in this fight. It made him realize just how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't just his wife, she was his partner, his equal in this battle, and she was ready to face whatever came next. With a determined breath, Mark stood up, pulling Sarah to her feet. "Then let's do this. Let's take them down before they can hurt anyone else." They spent the next few hours combing through the intel Mark had gathered. It was clear the syndicate's grip on the HOA wasn't just about control over property or rules, it was a front for something much darker. Their influence spread into the local government, using the HOA as a vehicle to push through illegal real estate deals, laundering money, and silencing anyone who got too close. Mark knew they needed hard evidence to take them down, something that would expose the syndicate for what it was. But as the hours passed and they dug deeper, something didn't feel right. It was too quiet. They hadn't heard from the enforcers, the people who had attacked Sarah in their driveway, and that worried Mark. In his experience, silence often meant they were regrouping, planning their next move. Just as he was about to voice his concern, a sudden knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Mark's hand instinctively went to the gun he kept holstered at his side. Sarah's eyes locked with his, her expression tense. "Who's that?" Mark gestured for her to stay back as he moved toward the door. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Slowly, he turned the handle and cracked the door open, keeping a wary eye on the street. Standing on the porch was a man Mark didn't recognize, but the way he carried himself, the sharp suit, the confident posture, told Mark everything he needed to know. The man's cold, calculating gaze met Mark's as he spoke. "Mr. Wright, I'm sure you've heard of me. My name is Robert Mallory, and I represent interests that you wouldn't want to ignore. May I come in?" Mark didn't answer immediately. His instincts screamed at him to slam the door and lock it, but he knew he couldn't just brush this man off. He had walked straight into their lives, and he wasn't leaving without a fight. "We can talk out here," Mark replied, his voice measured. Mallory's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. "I think we both know that's not going to work, Mr. Wright. You and your wife have been making quite a bit of noise lately. That doesn't sit well with the people I represent. I suggest you reconsider your next move." The door suddenly felt too thin, the walls too weak to keep the danger out. Mark could feel the tension rise, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were being watched, being hunted, and Mallory was here to make sure they understood just how far this syndicate would go to protect its secrets. "I'm not backing down," Mark said firmly, his voice low but full of conviction. "So you can either leave, or we can make sure you never threaten us again." For a moment, Mallory didn't respond. The silence hung between them like a storm about to break. Then, without a word, he stepped back from the door, his gaze lingering on Mark and Sarah with cold intensity. "You're making a mistake," Mallory finally said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But you'll learn soon enough." He turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the night. Mark stood there, his heart pounding, the weight of the situation heavier than ever. They were in deep now, and there was no turning back. As Sarah joined him by the door, she looked up at him with a mixture of fear and determination. "What now?" Mark glanced down at her, his mind racing. "Now, we make sure they don't get the chance to hurt us. This fight is just beginning." The next few days passed in a haze of fear and preparation. Every knock at the door, every car that drove past their house, set Mark's nerves on edge. Mallory's warning echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that they were no longer just dealing with petty neighborhood bullies. They were up against a dangerous criminal network that would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Mark and Sarah had taken extra precautions. They installed security cameras around the house, made sure all the windows were locked, and even changed their phone numbers. But despite all their efforts, the weight of knowing they were being hunted loomed over them. Mark had always prided himself on being prepared, on staying ahead of the enemy, but now, for the first time in his career, he felt like they were always one step behind. Sarah, however, seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Her determination to stand by Mark only deepened. She wasn't just watching from the sidelines anymore, she was in the thick of it with him, helping him research the syndicate and strategize their next move. Mark had tried to protect her, to shield her from this world he had created, but she refused to be sidelined. She had seen the danger firsthand and wasn't about to let fear control their lives. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, going over the latest intel, Sarah's voice broke the silence. "Mark, we can't keep running. We need to take action. The longer we wait, the more we risk losing control." Mark looked up from the papers in front of him, his eyes meeting hers. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had fallen in love with all those years ago. She was ready to fight, and for the first time in a long while, Mark found himself questioning his instincts. He had always been the protector, always been the one making the decisions, but maybe it was time to listen to her. "You're right," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of their situation. "We've been on the defensive for too long. It's time to go on the offensive. We need to take them down, and we need to do it now." The plan started taking shape slowly but surely. They would target the syndicate's weak points, those areas where they thought they were untouchable. Mark had a contact in the FBI who could help with surveillance, and Sarah had begun researching the syndicate's financial records, trying to uncover any illegal transactions that would tie them to their criminal activities. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A fragile thread of hope that Mark clung to, knowing that the further they dug, the more they would expose. But with each step forward, the danger escalated. Mallory's warning was a constant reminder that they were pushing their luck. And Mark knew that if they weren't careful, they could be walking straight into a trap. Late one night, as Mark sat alone in his office, poring over the documents they had gathered, his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. "Mr. Wright," a voice on the other end said, smooth and cold. "I'm sure you're aware that you've made some very bad decisions. But let me make it clear, your little crusade is over. You have two choices. Back off, or face the consequences. This is your final warning." Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was Mallory's voice, unmistakable. The message was clear: stop digging into the syndicate's business, or they would make sure he paid the price. "I'm not backing down," Mark said, his voice unwavering despite the fear creeping up his spine. "You can try to threaten me all you want, but I won't stop. This ends now." There was a brief silence on the other end, and for a moment, Mark wondered if Mallory was going to retaliate immediately. But then the voice returned, dripping with contempt. "Very well, Mr. Wright. But know this, no one is untouchable. And that includes your wife." The call abruptly ended, and Mark was left staring at the screen, his hands trembling slightly. They had crossed a line now, one they couldn't go back from. Mallory wasn't just threatening Mark anymore, he was threatening Sarah. Panic surged through Mark's chest, but he quickly shoved it down. He couldn't afford to let fear control him now. Not when they were so close to bringing the syndicate down. He walked into the living room where Sarah was waiting, her eyes locked on him. She had heard the tense conversation on the phone, and she didn't need him to say a word to know what had happened. "They're going to come after us again," Mark said, his voice low. "And this time, they'll stop at nothing." Sarah stood up, her gaze unwavering. "We're ready for them. We can't back down now. We'll face them head on, just like we've always done. We're a team, Mark." Her words, simple but strong, were the anchor Mark needed. He realized then that they had come too far to turn back. The battle was no longer just about exposing the syndicate, it was about survival. And together, they would fight until the very end. As the night wore on, Mark and Sarah put the final touches on their plan. They knew the risk. They knew the dangers. But they were ready. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of clarity, a clear path forward, no matter how treacherous it might be. They were going to take the syndicate down. And this time, nothing would stop them. The tension in the air felt suffocating as Mark and Sarah finalized their plan. They were no longer waiting for the storm to hit, they were going to make the first move. There was no time to waste, no room for mistakes. They had been playing defense for far too long. Now, it was time to take the fight to the syndicate, to expose them once and for all. Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at the final draft of their plan. Every detail had been carefully mapped out. They had everything they needed, the evidence, the strategy, and the will to take down the people who had threatened their lives. But as he reviewed the papers one last time, a deep sense of dread gnawed at him. This was it. There was no going back now. Sarah joined him at the table, her eyes sharp, focused. She had been his rock through this entire ordeal, never once backing down, and today was no different. "We've got this," she said, her voice steady, though Mark could see the underlying tension in her posture. "We're not going to let them win." Mark looked at her, the weight of what they were about to do sinking in. He had always been the protector, always the one to carry the burden, but now, standing beside Sarah, he realized they were in this together. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about them, and the life they were building. He wouldn't let anyone take that away. I don't know what will happen next, Mark said softly. But if anything happens to you, I won't forgive myself. Sarah reached out, her hand on his. You won't have to. We're stronger than they think. And we're doing this together. We'll fight, we'll win, and we'll make sure they never threaten us again. Her words were a reminder of the strength that lay within them both. Together, they were unstoppable. The night before they were scheduled to take action, Mark couldn't sleep. His mind raced, replaying every conversation, every warning, every decision they had made. The stakes had never been higher, and with each passing moment, it felt like the walls were closing in. He stood up, walking to the window and peering out into the darkened street. The house was quiet, too quiet. The shadows seemed to stretch further than they ever had, and the world outside felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. But they weren't going to wait anymore. Tomorrow, they would take the fight to the syndicate. As he turned back to the room, his phone buzzed on the table. He didn't recognize the number, but the sense of dread that had been growing inside him tightened at the sound of it. Hesitating only for a moment, he answered. Mr. Wright, the voice on the other end was familiar. It was Mallory. I'm sure you've been expecting this. You've been playing a dangerous game, and now it's time to face the consequences. Mark's heart sank. The calmness in Mallory's voice only made it worse. He had no intention of backing down. You'll regret this, Mallory. It's over. Mallory's laugh was cold, chilling. We'll see about that. But remember, you've already crossed the line. You've threatened my people, and now, I'm going to make you pay. The call ended abruptly, leaving Mark staring at his phone, the weight of the words sinking in. He had known this day was coming, but hearing it from Mallory's mouth made it feel all too real. The enforcers, the syndicate, they weren't just going to walk away. They were coming after him. Coming after Sarah. Mark's mind raced with options, but one thing was clear, they couldn't keep running. They had to act now, before it was too late. He turned to Sarah, who had been watching him closely from the doorway. She had heard the call. Her expression was calm, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. We're not backing down, Sarah said, her voice firm. We'll deal with him tomorrow. We'll finish this once and for all. Mark nodded. Tomorrow's the day we take control. Tomorrow, we end this. The next morning, they were ready. Mark had coordinated with his FBI contact to set up surveillance and make sure they had backup in case things went south. Sarah had gathered everything they needed, documents, records, and the final pieces of evidence to expose the syndicate. They couldn't afford to fail. This was their only shot. The day was tense. The plan was set in motion, and Mark and Sarah were on their way to meet their contact. They drove in silence, the weight of what they were about to do heavy on their shoulders. Mark's thoughts kept drifting to the call from Mallory. The threat against Sarah, against them both, it was a constant reminder that the stakes were high. But they couldn't hesitate now. They had come too far. As they pulled up to the meeting point, Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He looked over at Sarah, who was sitting beside him, her face calm but determined. Are you ready? He asked. Sarah nodded, her hand gripping his tightly. We're in this together, Mark. No matter what happens. They stepped out of the car and approached the meeting spot, the air thick with the tension of what was to come. They knew the risk. They knew the danger. But they were ready to face it. The syndicate's reign of terror was about to end. As Mark walked toward their contact, the sudden sound of screeching tires cut through the air. Mark's heart dropped. The danger they had been running from, the threat of Mallory's people, had arrived. They weren't going to make it out unscathed. But it was too late to turn back now. They were in the fight of their lives. The screeching tires were followed by the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming shut. Mark's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he turned toward Sarah, her face pale but resolute. They had known this was coming, the syndicate wouldn't let them expose the truth so easily, but hearing it so close, so immediate, made it all feel real. They were surrounded. Mark's hand instinctively went to his gun, but before he could react, he heard footsteps from behind. He spun around, his eyes locking with a man dressed in a dark suit, Robert Mallory. The same cold, calculating look in his eyes, but now, it was mixed with something darker, something more dangerous. "Did you really think you could walk away from this?" Mallory sneered, his voice low and menacing. "You've made a mess of things, Mr. Wright. And now, you're going to pay the price." Mark stood tall, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. He had no illusions about this fight. It was do or die. But he wasn't going to back down. Not when everything was on the line. "I'm not going anywhere, Mallory." "And neither is my wife," Mark said, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "You've made one mistake after another, and today, it ends." Mallory chuckled, his grin widening. "Oh, this is far from over. You're in way too deep now, Mr. Wright. But don't worry, when this is all over, no one will remember your name." Behind Mallory, several other men appeared, their faces hard and cold. Mark scanned the situation quickly, there were at least 5 of them, all armed. But Mark wasn't without resources. His FBI contact, who had promised backup, should be on his way. The problem was that the syndicate worked fast. They had the connections, the manpower, and the ruthlessness to stop anyone in their path. But they didn't know one thing: Mark wasn't alone in this fight. He turned to Sarah, who was standing just behind him, her eyes sharp. She was scared, he could see that, but there was no hesitation in her stance. She had become more than just the woman he loved. She had become his partner, his equal in this battle. Together, they were stronger than any threat that came their way. "We're doing this," Sarah said, her voice low but fierce. "We've already come this far. We finish this now." Mark nodded, feeling a surge of determination. They were ready. They were stronger than Mallory and his men realized. Suddenly, the sound of sirens blared in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Mark's pulse quickened. This was the moment. The backup had arrived. It was time to make their move. Mallory's eyes flicked toward the sound, his expression faltering for a brief moment. "You think you can win this? You think they'll save you? You've already lost." But Mark was already moving. With one swift motion, he pulled out his phone and pressed a button. The moment he did, several FBI agents emerged from the surrounding area, weapons drawn, surrounding Mallory and his men. The syndicate's men froze, their hands instinctively going to their holsters, but it was too late. They were trapped. Mallory's face twisted with fury as he realized the game was up. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat, his eyes narrowing. "But you're too late. There's still time." Mark didn't wait for another word. He stepped forward, his voice cold. "There is no more time for you, Mallory. This ends now." With a single nod from Mark, the FBI agents moved in. In seconds, Mallory and his men were subdued, handcuffed, and taken into custody. The weight of the situation finally began to sink in for Mark. It was over. They had won. As the agents secured the area, Mark turned to Sarah, his heart pounding but his mind clear. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. Sarah stepped closer to him, a smile breaking through her earlier tension. "We did. We're safe." Mark wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. For the first time in weeks, he felt like they could breathe again. They had faced the darkness together, and they had come out victorious. The fight had been long, exhausting, and filled with moments of uncertainty, but they had never lost sight of what mattered most: their love, their bond, and the life they had built together. As the FBI agents took Mallory and his crew away, Mark knew they had done something bigger than just take down a criminal syndicate. They had reclaimed their lives. They had fought back against the people who tried to destroy everything they held dear, and they had emerged stronger. They had survived. And that was something no one, no syndicate, no corrupt organization, could ever take away from them.